The morning they cast Marian Graves into the snow, she was wearing her mother's dress. It was the last garment she owned that had not yet been reclaimed by the new master of Ashgrove. The gown was pale gray wool, mended at both cuffs, and it was entirely insufficient for the kind of cold that had settled over the county of Derbyshire that January, the kind that came not from wind, but from a sky pressed flat against the hills, promising nothing so generous as a storm. Marian had stood in the doorway of the house she had grown up in, and looked at the carriage waiting in the lane, and she had not wept. She was 22 years old. She had known since her father's death 8 months prior that this morning was coming. She had simply not known it would come in January, or that Clement Rowe, the cousin who now held the entailed estate, would stand in the entrance hall in his good coat and watch the footman carry out her trunk without speaking a single word to her directly. It was Lady Rowe who spoke. She had that facility. "You were always going to be temporary," she said from behind her husband's shoulder, and her voice was pleasant and final, the way a door is pleasant when it closes softly and locks. The carriage was going to Bakewell. Marian had secured a position as a lady's companion to a Mrs. Hartwell, a widow of good character and modest income who required someone to read to her in the evenings and manage her correspondence. It was work. It was honest. It was as far from Ashgrove as a carriage ride in January could manage, which was not far enough. The snow began before they reached the first crossroads. She pressed her forehead to the cold glass and watched the fields go white and thought about the library she had left behind, 400 books in their shelves in the east-facing room, and the particular quality of morning light through those windows, and the way her mother had kept a specific volume, Cowper's collected poems, on the corner of the lower shelf, where a hand naturally fell. She thought about all of this with the careful precision of someone storing what they are not yet certain of keeping. What Marian did not yet know, on that gray morning of her dispossession, was that the road to Bakewell passed within a quarter-mile of Harwick Hall, and that the Earl of Harwick was, at that precise hour, standing at the tall windows of his study and watching the lane below with the particular attention of a man who has learned that most things he notices end badly. He had been High Sheriff of Derbyshire for 3 years. He had held the position because the Lord Lieutenant had pressed it upon him, and because, as Richard Calloway had understood from boyhood, there are obligations that arrive with land and title whether a man desires them or not. He was 34 years old, and he had the look of a man who has made many decisions he cannot unmake. He was looking at a carriage. He was looking at the glass. And inside the glass there was a pale gray sleeve and a forehead, and the careful stillness of someone who had decided not to cry. He looked for longer than he ought. His steward, Mr. Bowen, was reading aloud from the correspondence. He had been reading aloud for some minutes. "My lord," Mr. Bowen said, and paused. "Continue," he said, and did not look away from the lane until the carriage was gone. If you have ever watched someone carry their whole life out of a house in a single trunk, you will know the kind of story this is. Stay close. Marian settled at Mrs. Hartwell's house on the edge of Bakewell with the efficiency of someone who had learned young that settling was its own form of survival. The rooms were clean. The fires were adequate. Mrs. Hartwell was a round, kind woman of 60, whose eyesight had begun to fail, and who wanted, above all things, to be read to from improving works of natural philosophy. And Marian read to her willingly and with attention, and managed the correspondence with the precision of someone who had been running an estate since she was 17. She rose at 6 every morning and made a full accounting of Mrs. Hartwell's household affairs before breakfast, not because it was required of her, but because she understood that order was the only architecture available to her now. She inventoried the linen. She kept the accounts in a hand the Derby solicitor would later call remarkably legible. She read aloud every evening after supper, from whatever volume Mrs. Hartwell selected, and she did not skim, and she did not rush, and she answered every question about fossils and limestone and the migratory patterns of northern birds with the same precise attention she gave the household ledger. She was the sort of woman, Mrs. Hartwell told her sister in a letter, who could make a small household feel well governed without ever making the household's mistress feel governed, which was a rarer skill than most people understood and worth more than most people paid for it. It was not a diminished life. It was a life she had made, and it was hers. Her father had taught her to manage accounts. It was the most useful thing he had done for her, and it had cost him nothing at the time, which was the condition under which Edward Graves had performed most kindnesses. The difficulty was the papers. 3 weeks after Marian's arrival at Mrs. Hartwell's, a letter came from Clement Rowe's solicitor. It was written in a careful hand, and it said, in language designed to confuse, that the personal effects remaining at Ashgrove, specifically the library of some 400 volumes that had been her mother's, and which her father had promised to her in a letter before his death, would be sold at auction at the end of the month to settle the estate's obligations. The letter did not mention that her father's letter had named the library as hers by specific bequest. The letter did not mention a great many things. Marian read it twice. Then she read it a third time, slowly, the way she had learned to read documents that were trying to misdirect her. Then she put it down on the small desk in her room and sat with her hands flat on the table for a long time. The library was not a grand thing by any standard of the county. It was 400 volumes accumulated across 50 years by a woman who had believed in the life of the mind and had passed that belief to her daughter the only way she could, through the smell of old paper and the weight of a well-bound book in a child's hands. The library was Marian's education. It was the only inheritance she had ever been promised with specificity and in writing. It was also, she understood now, going to be taken from her, because Clement Rowe's solicitor had written a letter that was very carefully shaped so that she would not understand her legal options in time to exercise them. She understood her legal options. She asked Mrs. Hartwell for the use of the writing desk and 2 sheets of good paper, and she wrote 2 letters. The first was to the solicitor in Derby who had held her father's original estate papers. The second was more difficult to write, and she sat with the pen lifted above the page for a long moment before she set it down. The second letter was to the Earl of Harwick, in his capacity as High Sheriff of Derbyshire. She had met him once at a subscription assembly in Bakewell the previous autumn, before her father's death had reduced the world to practicalities. He had stood near the door in a dark coat and declined to dance, which the room had found perplexing, and she had found him perplexing also, for a different reason. He had been watching the room with the quality of attention she associated with men who were trying to understand something they had not yet named. He had spoken to her once, briefly, about the question of road improvements between Bakewell and Matlock, and he had listened to her answer with the kind of stillness that indicated he was actually listening, rather than waiting for her to finish. She had thought about that quality of stillness more times than was strictly sensible since. She wrote the letter. She explained the situation with precision and without apology. She cited the relevant legal instrument, the writ of prohibition that could halt the auction if her father's bequest letter was placed before the appropriate authority before the month's end. She wrote clearly, and she wrote from her knowledge of her own case, and then she sealed the letter and took it to the post herself, because she did not trust anyone else's hands with it. She did not expect an answer. He read the letter at 7 in the morning, standing at his desk without sitting down. He read it again. He set it beside the breakfast things without eating anything. He thought about the pale gray sleeve pressed against the carriage glass. And then he thought about the letter. And then he thought about what a man who held the office he held was required to do when the law was being used as a mechanism for dispossession, which was precisely what was being done here. He sent for Mr. Bowen, "I want the estate papers for the Graves property at Ashgrove," he said. "I want the entail documentation, and I want the correspondence from Rose's solicitor. I want everything by noon." Mr. Bowen, who had been in service at Harwick Hall for 11 years and had learned to read the particular quality of quiet in his employer's voice, said, "Yes, my lord," and went. He sat down at his desk and read the letter a third time. It was the legal precision of it that stopped him. Not the situation, which was deplorable but not uncommon. Not the dispossession, which was a consequence of entail law that had ground through 100 families like this one. It was the precision, the citation, the specific named instrument she had reached for without anyone to guide her hand toward it. She had taught herself. In the middle of a grief she had not been permitted to lay down, she had taught herself enough law to write a letter like this one, and she had written it not in panic, but in the cool, measured register of someone who knew exactly what they needed and exactly why they were entitled to it. He was the High Sheriff. He had the authority. The question was not whether to act. The question was why his hands were not entirely steady. He thought about the gray gown. He thought about the word temporary, spoken in a pleasant voice by a woman who had nothing to fear from its cruelty. He picked up his pen. Marian received his reply 4 days later, on a Tuesday morning, while she was reading aloud to Mrs. Hartwell from a work on the natural history of Derbyshire's limestone formations. She had to read the passage about the fossils twice. She had to set down the book and pick up the letter from the tray she had carried in with the morning post, and she had to read the letter while Mrs. Hartwell waited with the patience of a woman who had grown old, watching young people receive letters. He had issued the writ, not the response she had asked for, which had been a formal inquiry that might in time have produced the writ. He had issued it directly, citing the documented bequest and the insufficient notice to the heir's representative. The auction was suspended. The Derby solicitor was contacted. The Rowe family's man had been formally notified that any further disposal of library assets would constitute an interference with the execution of the writ. Marian looked at the letter until the word stopped swimming. "Good news?" said Mrs. Hartwell pleasantly. "Yes," said Marian. "I think so." She thought about what it cost a man of his station to move with this speed over the complaint of a woman with no property and no rank. She thought about it for a long time that afternoon, after Mrs. A. Hartwell had napped while the snow came down outside the small windows of the house in Bakewell. She thought about it the way she had thought about his stillness at the assembly, carefully and from a distance, as though it were a problem she could solve if she looked long enough. It did not feel like the action of a man performing his office. It felt like the action of a man who had read her letter and been angry on her behalf. She did not know what to do with that distinction. The road from Harwick Hall to Ashgrove passed through Bakewell. He told himself this was a matter of practicality when he found himself slowing the horse on the high street, when he dismounted before Mrs. Hartwell's house, with the kind of purposeful air that Mr. Bowen would have recognized as a man who has constructed a reason for doing something he already intended to do. He had papers to deliver. It was true. A second set of documents had come in from Derby, and they required the heir's representative's signature, and someone ought to carry them to Miss Graves so that she understood the full scope of what had been filed. He was the sheriff. He was going to Ashgrove. The road passed through Bakewell. These were simply facts in sequence. Mrs. Hartwell's housekeeper opened the door and led him to the small sitting room where Marian was on her feet before he reached the threshold, because she had seen his horse in the street and had known from the quality of her own stillness in the 30 seconds between the sight and the sound of the knocker that she was not prepared for this. She prepared herself anyway. It was what she did. He was taller than she remembered, and she had remembered him as tall. He was wearing a dark greatcoat still damp at the shoulders from the ride, and his hat was in his hands, and he looked at her in the doorway of the sitting room with the particular quality of attention she had first noticed in the ballroom at the assembly, except that now it was not the room he was mapping. It was her face. "Miss Graves," he said. "My lord," she said. "Thank you for coming. I did not expect you to come in person." "There are papers," he said, and held them out. She took them. They were both aware that the papers were, in some respect, a reason for his being here, rather than the reason for his being here. "You cited the correct instrument," he said. "The writ of prohibition. You cited it precisely. I need you to understand what that means. It means the matter proceeds." "I know what it means," she said. "I wrote it correctly because I needed it to be correct." He looked at her for a moment. "Your father's solicitor in Derby has the bequest letter." "Yes." "Rowe's man will contest." "Let him," she said, and her voice was even, and she watched something shift in his expression. A slight adjustment at the jaw, as though he had not expected that. The papers required her signature in 3 places. She signed them at Mrs. Hartwell's writing desk, seated, with him standing at a correct distance behind her, and she was aware with the precision of a woman who had learned to read the room that he was not looking at the papers. When she stood and turned, he was close. Not improperly close. He was closer than he had been, and the room was not large, and winter light came through the window and fell across his face in a way that made him look, for just a moment, less like a man in command of a formal proceeding, and more like a man who had been trying to decide something for some weeks and had not yet arrived at the answer. "The auction date is suspended for 30 days, he said. "After that, the court reviews the filing. You should be in Bakewell." "I am in Bakewell," she said. "I know," he said, and did not explain what he meant, and she did not ask. He left. She stood at the window and watched him mount the horse and ride south, toward Ashgrove, and she pressed her hand flat against the cold glass, without entirely understanding why. It would be a lie to say that Marian did not think about that meeting. It would also be a lie to say she was surprised when, 3 days later, a note arrived from Harwick Hall. It was brief. It said that his inquiry had uncovered a second document, a letter from her father to the Derby solicitor dated 6 months before his death, explicitly reiterating the library bequest with an appended list of the volumes in question. The note said that this document, in combination with the first, would make the court's review considerably clearer. It closed by saying that he would be in Bakewell again the following Thursday for the magistrate's session, if she wished to review the documents. If she wished to review the documents, as though that were all it was. She wrote back and said she would be available on Thursday morning. Mrs. Hartwell, who was not so blind as her eyesight suggested, said nothing over supper, and smiled at her teacup. The magistrate's session ran until noon. He came to Mrs. Hartwell's house at 12:30, with the documents under his arm and his hat already in his hand, and he stayed for an hour and 3/4, and they went through the papers at the writing desk. And then they talked about the limestone formations in the Derwent Valley because she had been reading about them aloud, and he had opinions about them, specific and grounded opinions that she had not expected, and she sat across from him in Mrs. Hartwell's small sitting room and thought about how long it had been since anyone had expected her to have an opinion, and then had actually listened to it. He came back the following Thursday. He arrived again at 12:30, and this time he declined tea, and then accepted it. And Mrs. Hartwell appeared briefly in the doorway, before recollecting she had promised to rest, and they sat for 2 hours with the papers between them, and talked about whether the Derby solicitor would move fast enough, and about the particular iniquity of entail law, and he held views on it that surprised her both in their anger and in their specificity. He was not a man who held his opinions loosely. She had not known how much she had missed speaking with someone who did not. And the Thursday after that. On the fourth Thursday, he sat down with the papers, and then sat with the papers unopened in his hands, and said, "The court date is set for the 17th. "Yes," she said. I received the notice. "I want you to understand what will happen," he said. "Rose's solicitor will argue that the bequest letter was informal, that it carries no legal weight against the entail's terms. I know what he will argue. You will need to appear." "I know." He set the papers on the table. Set the papers on. He did not open them. "I want you to know," he said, "that the filing is sound, that your case is sound." She looked at him. He was looking at his hands. "You did not come here to tell me the filing is sound," she said. A silence. "No," he said. She waited. The fire was low. Mrs. Hartwell was napping, as she napped every Thursday afternoon, with the benevolent predictability of a woman who had lived long enough to know when to be elsewhere. There was someone, he said, who knew the law and trusted that it would work as it was intended to work. She trusted it without having anyone to tell her it was trustworthy. That seems to me a significant thing to have done. Marian's hands, folded in her lap, did not move. Her breath did something quiet and involuntary that she hoped he had not heard. "I was alone for 3 years, before I was not," he said. "I thought I was managing. I was told I was managing. I believed I was managing. And then someone sent me a letter citing the writ of prohibition, and I read it, and I thought, what a considerable amount of courage that took to write." She was looking at him. He was still looking at his hands. "You may tell me," she said, "if there is something you are trying to say." He looked up. His eyes were gray in the winter light, and in them she saw something she had not allowed herself to name across 4 Thursdays and all their careful papers. It was recognition. Not the kind the world performed. The kind that comes from watching someone work and understanding what the work costs and choosing to name what you have seen. "I am not practicing any declaration," he said. "I am trying to say it plainly, because you deserve plain speech. And the plain speech is this. I have been looking for a reason to come to Bakewell for considerably longer than the law has required it of me." She was very still. "I know," she said at last. "Do you?" he said. "I have read too many legal documents to mistake intent," she said, and something almost like a smile moved at the corner of his mouth, a brief and private thing that she suspected was rare, and understood she had just been given. He reached across the small table. His hand was near hers, not quite touching, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him against the cold air. A near touch, nothing resolved, everything possible. "Then I would like," he said, with the careful precision of a man who meant to be exact, "your permission to call on you. Properly." She looked at his hand. She looked at his face. "You have it," she said. "If you are still with this story, you will understand already what that permission contained." The court hearing on the 17th of February took place in the County Hall at Derby, in a cold room with high windows and long benches occupied by men in dark coats who spoke in the language of procedure and precedent. The room smelled of paper and coal and the particular stale air of authority that has been exercised in the same walls for 50 years. Marian sat in the gallery with her hands folded in her lap, wearing her mother's gray dress and her own gray coat, and she listened to Clement Rose's solicitor attempt to argue that an explicit written bequest was not an explicit written bequest. He argued it for 40 minutes. He used language she had anticipated, the informal nature of a private letter, the absence of a formal codicil, the supremacy of the entail over any posthumous expression of personal wish. He argued it with the smooth competence of a man who had made the same argument before in rooms very like this one, and had often won because the person on the other side had not known how to counter it. Marian had known how to counter it since November. She had set out the counter-argument in her original letter to the Earl of Harwick, which had formed the basis of the writ, which had formed the basis of the filing that the Derby solicitor had prepared with, she was grateful to note, the same precision she had asked for. The bequest letter named the volumes by the same appended list that appeared in the second document, the one Richard had found. 2 documents, in 2 different hands, on 2 different dates, making the same specific provision. That was not informal. That was a pattern of intent. The judge read the documents. He read them carefully, which Marian had prepared herself to be grateful for, and was. Then he looked up over his spectacles at the Row solicitor and said, in the moderate tone of a man who has made decisions of greater consequence before breakfast, that the bequest letter was legally sound, the bequest was therefore valid, and the library at Ashgrove was the property of Miss Marian Graves by her father's documented wish. And the auction was dismissed. In the gallery, Marian sat very still. She pressed her hands flat against her knees. Below in the court, the Earl stood at the side of the room. He had not spoken. He had come not as the party to the case, but as a man who had prepared the filing and intended to see it through. And he had stood without speaking, and watched the proceedings with the measured patience she had come to recognize as his form of attention. When the judge spoke his decision, he did not move. He looked up at the gallery. He found her face. She did not look away. After the court cleared, he met her at the foot of the gallery stairs. He did not offer congratulations, which she appreciated, because this was not a victory she wanted performed for her. The library can be removed from Ashgrove within 2 weeks, he said. I would recommend the Derby solicitor handle the formal logistics. I have already written to him, she said. Something moved in his expression. Not surprise. Something warmer than surprise. Of course you have, he said. They walked out of the county hall into the February cold, and the city was gray and specific around them, and it was not a warm day, but she was not cold. It was Lady Rowe who saw them first. She had not expected to see Marian. She had not expected to see the Earl of Harwick. She had expected, at most, to receive a curt note from the court and manage the logistics at Ashgrove with the quiet efficiency of a woman who knew how to absorb reversals without showing the seam. She was at the entrance of the county hall with her gloved hand on the door when she saw them walk out together, unhurried, in the gray February air, and she went very still. Clement Rowe's solicitor had not warned them what it would look like. Marian saw her. She felt the moment Lady Rowe took in the picture, felt the specific recalibration that moved through the woman's posture like a chill. Lady Rowe, Marian said evenly, because she was not given to cruelty. Lady Rowe looked at her. She looked at the Earl of Harwick. She looked at the space between them, which was the space of 2 people who have sat across a table from each other for 4 Thursdays, and know the temperature of each other's silence. Miss Graves, she said, and her voice was as careful as a woman's voice can be, when the sentence she had rehearsed for 8 months is no longer the correct sentence. The court has confirmed my father's bequest, Marian said. The library will be removed from Ashgrove within the fortnight. I hope the process will be straightforward. Lady Rowe opened her mouth. She closed it. She looked once more at the Earl, and whatever she saw in his face, it was not the comfortable absence she had counted on. She was not a stupid woman. She had simply, for 8 months, been permitted to act as though she were the only person in the room who understood what the room contained. I see, she said, finally. It was not sufficient. It was something. They walked to the carriage. He handed her in with the particular care of a man who is aware that he is being watched from a doorway and has decided he does not mind. The carriage moved. The county hall disappeared behind them, and Marian sat across from him in the small, cold interior and looked out the window at the February city. "She will say things," Marian said. "People will hear them," he said. "And then they will hear other things." She looked at him. "I intend to call on you," he said. "Properly and publicly, with Mrs. Hartwell's knowledge. The rest will follow." The rest will follow. She turned the phrase over in her mind like a coin, feeling the weight of it. He was a man who said what he meant. She had learned this about him across 4 Thursdays and a set of legal documents, and one moment in a small sitting room when he had looked up from his hands, and she had understood that some kinds of recognition are not performances. "You are very certain of that," she said. "I am certain of what I intend," he said. "The rest can take its own time." She looked out the window at the Derbyshire hills, going brown and gray under the last of the winter. And she thought about her father's library, 400 books her mother had gathered across 50 years, soon to be in her care. She thought about Ashgrove as it had been when her father was alive, full of the particular warmth of a house that had been loved even when it was not managed well. She thought about January and the pale gray sleeve against the cold glass of a carriage window, and a man at a tall window who had looked and looked until the carriage was gone. She thought about a small sitting room on Thursday afternoons, and paper that smelled of a clean professional hand, and the specific quality of being listened to. "When you call," she said, "I would like to walk. There is a path above the river that I have not yet walked in this season. I am told it is worth the cold." "I am told the same," he said. And she could hear in his voice something she had not heard there before. A warmth at the edge of the measured quiet. The faint sound of a man who has decided on a direction and is no longer bracing for the wind. The path above the River Derwent in early spring is the kind of path that asks nothing of you but presence. The snow had been gone for 3 weeks. The hills had gone from white to gray-brown to the tentative green of a Derbyshire march, and the river was high and cold and running fast over limestone, and the sky above them was the pale blue of a morning that had not yet warmed itself into certainty. Marian wore her good coat and her better gloves, and he walked beside her at the distance required by propriety and several steps closer than required by anything else, and they talked about the river and the limestone formations, and the question of whether the spring would hold. They did not talk about what this was. Some things require only the doing. He stopped at the bend where the river widened, where an old willow trailed its bare branches into the current, and the bank was broad and still. "I have been corresponding with Mrs. Hartwell," he said. Marian turned. "She finds me adequate," he said. Something that had been held very carefully inside Marian's chest for some weeks released itself without her permission. "She finds most people adequate," she said. "She is a kind woman. She mentioned," he said, "that the house in Bakewell is, in her own phrase, perhaps not your permanent situation." "She is perceptive," said Marian. He looked at her. The river ran behind him. The willow moved in the cool March air. His face was the face she had learned across Thursday afternoons, the careful jaw and the gray eyes and the quality of attention that did not scan the room for something more important. "I have a library," he said, "at Harwick Hall. It is not so much a matter of sentiment as yours, but it is substantial, and it lacks, I have come to understand, a person who cares about it in the correct way." She waited. "Miss Graves," he said, and stopped, and then began again, with the care of a man who is aware that he has said versions of this once before, badly, and intends now to say it exactly as he means it. Marian, I would not ask you to exchange one obligation for another. You have spent enough of your life managing other people's houses. I am asking you to manage nothing. I am asking you to come to Harwick Hall because I want you there. Not as an arrangement, not as a practical resolution, because I want you there. The river ran. She looked at his face. She thought about January, the gray dress and the cold glass, and the careful stillness of someone who had decided not to cry. She thought about a letter written to a stranger at a desk in Bakewell, in the language of writs and prohibitions, the only language she had trusted the world to understand. She thought about what it was to be looked at, really looked at, by someone who had the social authority to look elsewhere and had simply declined to. Then I will come, she said, because I want to be there. He reached out. His hand found hers, gloved and unhurried, fingers wrapping around her fingers with the same careful precision with which he did everything, and she felt the warmth of him through the wool, a warmth that was and was not about cold. She had not cried in January. She did not cry now. Her eyes were bright, and she let them be. Later, they would tell the story in the way that stories get told. The woman cast out in the snow, who came back with the law in her hands, and the sheriff beside her. The county would have opinions about the engagement, some warm and some wary, and Lady Rowe would revise her position with the speed of a woman who has always known which way the weather runs. The Derby solicitor would oversee the transfer of the library to Harwick Hall, where it would sit in the East Wing alongside Richard Calloway's own volumes, 400 books among 400 others, without apology and without explanation. Simply there. In the spring, when the crocuses came up along the south wall of Harwick Hall, Marian walked the grounds twice a week and learned the house from the inside, its cold rooms and its warm ones, its habits and its grievances, the places where it was still in mourning for the woman Richard had lost 4 years prior, the child that had been buried with her, the particular silence of a man who had learned to hold his grief in the occupied posture of responsibility. She did not try to repair any of this. She sat beside it and was present, and slowly as a Derbyshire spring, the rooms warmed. She found, in the East Wing, a portrait turned to face the wall. She did not turn it back without asking him first. He came with her, and he turned it himself. And they stood before it together. And he said nothing. And she did not fill the silence with anything but her own presence beside him, which was what he needed, and what she understood without being told. He stood there a long time. Then he said her name, just the one syllable, Marian, in the quiet voice she had learned to listen for. And she took his hand the way he had taken hers at the river, unhurried and without performance. And they remained until the candle began to gutter, and the evening pressed against the windows, and there was nothing left to say that the silence had not already carried. The library was whole. That evening, she sat at the end of the long table in the East Wing, with the candles burning low, and the smell of old paper filled the room. And she ran her hand along a row of her mother's books, the spines worn smooth by the hands of a woman she had lost at 9. And she thought about what it was to keep a thing intact across all the weather the world could produce, to carry it through the snow and out the other side. She thought she understood it now. The fire crackled. The candlelight was warm across the rows of books. Outside the tall windows, Derbyshire lay patient and dark, and the first tentative stars were appearing over the eastern ridge, and somewhere deep in the house a clock was striking the hour in the unhurried way of clocks that have belonged to a place long enough to know it would not be rushed. She heard his step in the corridor. She heard him stop at the door. She did not turn, but she felt the warmth of him enter the room, the specific quality of his presence that she had learned to distinguish from other silences. "The library suits the room," he said. "It does," she said. He came to stand beside her. His hand found hers on the shelf, and she let him hold it. And they stood in the warm library, with the fire at their backs and the 400 books of her mother's gathering arrayed before them. And the night was still and cold outside. And here there was no cold at all. This is what was carried out of the snow. Not the books, though the books were saved. Not the papers, though the papers held. What was carried out of the snow was a woman who knew the law and used it, and a man who read a letter and understood what it had cost to write, and the specific, irreversible fact of being seen by someone who had no obligation to see you and chose to anyway. That is the story. It is complete. If Marian's journey moved you, leave a word below. Every story begun in a cold doorway deserves to know it found its way home.